Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories. Here we tell slow and gentle tales from history. Stories that calm your mind and help you fall asleep. If you enjoy the journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin tonight's dreamy story. Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back in time. Quite literally, to the invention of one of the most soothingly pointless objects in history, the hourglass. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's talk about sand. Yes, sand. Because apparently, humanity decided that the best way to measure the fleeting nature of existence was to trap beach particles in a glass bulb and watch them fall. Relaxing, right? Now, before you roll your eyes and think, wow, 3 hours of sand talk, thrilling, remember, this is history, which means it's never just about the object. It's about the people who are obsessed over it, the monks who stared at it, the sailors who trusted it, and the kings who probably used it to time how long their courtiers could grovel before collapsing. So let's begin. Slowly, like the first grain of sand, slipping through the glass, the hourglass, as far as we can tell, didn't just pop into existence one day. It was the product of centuries of human obsession with measuring time, because humans, for some reason, cannot just let time be. We have to chop it up, label it, and then stress about it. Sundials, water clocks, candle clocks, all of them were humanity's way of saying, we don't trust the sun, we need props. The hourglass, though, was different. It was portable. It was simple. And it was weirdly mesmerizing. 2 glass bulbs, sealed together, with sand trickling from one to the other. That's it. No gears. No complicated mechanics. Just gravity and boredom working together, and yet, this humble device became one of the most iconic timekeepers of the medieval and early modern world. It was on ships, in monasteries, in royal courts. It was painted into allegories of death, because of course it was. Nothing says memento mori like a tiny beach vacation in a bottle, reminding you that you're running out of time. Let's float back to the early origins. The hourglass probably emerged in Europe around the 8th century, though the evidence is fuzzy. Which is ironic, because the whole point of the hourglass was supposed to be precision. The earliest written references pop up in the 14th century, but historians suspect it was around long before that. After all, people don't just wake up one morning and say, hey, let's blow 2 glass bulbs and fill them with sand. The design was likely inspired by the water clock or clepsydra. Those had been around since ancient Egypt and Greece. But water clocks had problems. They froze in winter. They spilled. They required maintenance. And if you were on a ship, they were basically useless. Because waves and sloshing water don't mix well with delicate measurements. Sand, on the other hand, doesn't freeze. It doesn't slosh, it just falls relentlessly, like your will to live during a medieval sermon by the 14th century. The hourglass was showing up in European art and inventories. Monks loved them because they could time prayers. Sailors loved them because they could time watches at sea. And kings probably loved them because they could say, you have exactly 1 glass of sand to explain why you haven't paid your taxes. The sand itself wasn't just any sand. Oh no, medieval hourglass makers were picky. They used finely ground marble, or powdered eggshells, or even crushed burnt lead. Because apparently, nothing says time is precious like filling your glass with toxic dust. The bulbs were made of blown glass, carefully sealed with wax or resin, and the whole thing was mounted in a wooden frame, often decorated, because even your sand timer had to look fancy if you were a medieval noble. Let's pause here and appreciate the irony. The hourglass was supposed to represent precision, but in reality, it was wildly inconsistent. The flow of sand depended on humidity, the size of the grains, the angle of the bulbs. If you shook it, you could shave off minutes. If the sand clumped, you could lose time entirely. And yet people trusted it, because humans will trust anything that looks symmetrical and vaguely scientific. Sailors, in particular, leaned on the hourglass. On ships, they used half-hour glasses to mark the passage of time during watches. Every time the sand ran out, the bell was struck, and the next half hour began. This is why ship bells are still a thing. Not because of some grand naval tradition, but because some guy in the 14th century was staring at sand and thought, yeah, let's ring a bell now. And of course, the hourglass became a symbol. Painters loved it. Philosophers loved it. Poets loved it. Because nothing screams deep metaphor like sand falling in silence. It became shorthand for mortality, for the fleeting nature of life, for the fact that no matter how rich or powerful you were, your sand was running out. Unless you were a Habsburg, in which case your sand was running out and your jawline was collapsing. Now, let's drift into some of the stranger uses. In monasteries, hourglasses were used to time sermons, which means that somewhere, in some cold stone abbey, a monk was droning on about sin while another monk stared at sand, praying it would run out faster. Truly, the medieval version of watching the clock at work. In kitchens, hourglasses were used to time cooking, which is hilarious because medieval food was already a disaster. Imagine carefully timing your roast with an hourglass, only for it to still come out tasting like boiled sadness. And in medicine, doctors used hourglasses to time treatments, which is even funnier because medieval medicine was basically bleed them and hope. But sure, let's make sure the bleeding lasts exactly 1 glass of sand. Very scientific, the hourglass also became a status symbol. Wealthy nobles had ornate ones, decorated with gold and ivory, because nothing says I'm rich like owning a fancy sand timer. It's the medieval equivalent of buying a Rolex that doesn't actually tell time correctly, and yet, despite all its flaws, the hourglass endured. It was reliable enough, portable enough, and symbolic enough to stick around for centuries. Even after mechanical clocks became widespread, the hourglass held on. Because sometimes people don't want accuracy, they want vibes, and the hourglass had vibes. Let's float forward to the Renaissance. By this point, the hourglass was everywhere. Sailors carried them across oceans. Artists painted them into vanitas still lifes, surrounded by skulls and wilting flowers, just in case you forgot you were going to die. And scholars kept them on their desks, probably to time how long they could procrastinate before pretending to work. The symbolism deepened. The hourglass wasn't just about time. It was about inevitability, about the fact that once the sand started falling, you couldn't stop it. Unless, of course, you flipped it over, which is probably why philosophers loved it so much. Nothing like a cheap metaphor you can literally turn upside down. And so, the hourglass trickled its way into history. From ships to monasteries, from kitchens to courts, from art to medicine. A simple device, endlessly flawed, endlessly symbolic, endlessly human, because in the end, the hourglass wasn't really about measuring time. It was about reminding us that time is always slipping away, grain by grain, quietly, inevitably. So, Let's sink a little deeper into the sands of time. Literally, because if you thought the hourglass was just a quirky medieval gadget, you'd be wrong. It was also a cultural obsession. People couldn't stop painting it, writing about it, or staring at it like it was the medieval equivalent of a lava lamp. And honestly, that's not far off. Imagine you're a monk in the 13th century. You've got no Netflix, no TikTok, no distractions except chanting, copying manuscripts, and maybe the occasional plague. Then someone hands you an hourglass. Suddenly, you've got a tiny, mesmerizing stream of sand to watch. It's hypnotic, it's meditative. It's also a reminder that your life is slipping away grain by grain. But hey, at least it's aesthetically pleasing. The hourglass at Seelitz drift back to the sailors for a moment. Because if anyone truly embraced the hourglass, it was the men stuck on wooden tubs in the middle of the ocean. Mechanical clocks, useless at sea, sundials. Good luck with that on a cloudy day in the North Atlantic. But the hourglass, that worked. It didn't care about waves, storms, or latitude. It just kept trickling. Ships often carried dozens of them. Half-hour glasses, 4-hour glasses, even big ones for longer stretches. The half-hour glass was the most important. Every time it ran out, the ship's bell was struck. 1 bell for the first half hour, 2 for the next, and so on, until 8 bells marked the end of a 4-hour watch. That's why sailors still talk about 8 bells. It's not mystical, it's just sand. And here's the fun part. The accuracy of these glasses was questionable. If the sand was damp, it clumped. If the glass was tilted, the flow changed. If the grains were uneven, the timing was off. But sailors didn't care. They weren't looking for atomic precision. They just needed a rhythm. Something to mark the endless monotony of life at sea. So yes, the great age of exploration, Columbus, Magellan, Vasco da Gama, all of them relied on sand trickling through glass. Entire empires were built on the back of glorified egg timers. The hourglass in religion, meanwhile, back on land, the church was also obsessed. Monks used hourglasses to time prayers, sermons, and rituals, which is ironic because Christianity is all about eternity. And yet here they were, fixated on tiny parcels of time. Picture it, a monk droning on in Latin, while another monk flips the hourglass to make sure the sermon doesn't run too long. Though, let's be honest, it probably still felt like an eternity. The hourglass also became a symbol in religious art. You'll see it in manuscripts, paintings, even carved into tombs, always reminding the viewer, time is short, death is coming, better repent now. Nothing like a little sand-based anxiety to spice up your devotional life. The hourglass in daily life outside monasteries and ships. The hourglass trickled into everyday life. Kitchens used them to time cooking. Doctors used them to time treatments. Teachers used them to time lessons. And of course, nobles had to make them fancy. A simple wooden frame, too boring. Wealthy patrons commissioned hourglasses with ivory frames, gilded decorations, even jewels. Because if you're going to watch sand fall, it might as well be luxury sand. There are even records of hourglasses being given as diplomatic gifts. Imagine being a king and receiving a glorified sand toy as a token of respect. But hey, it was practical and symbolic, and probably easier to carry than a giant tapestry. The symbolism of sand now. Let's talk about the symbolism. Because the hourglass wasn't just a tool, it was a metaphor. Painters loved it. They stuck it into vanitous still lifes, surrounded by skulls, rotting fruit, and extinguished candles. The message was clear. Life is fleeting, death is certain. Enjoy your grapes while you can. Philosophers loved it too. The hourglass represented inevitability. Once the sand started falling, you couldn't stop it. Unless, of course, you flipped it over, which made it a perfect metaphor for cycles, renewal, and the illusion of control. Even today, the hourglass emoji is basically shorthand for time's up, proof that medieval symbolism still lingers in our digital lives. The hourglass, and science, believe it or not, the hourglass also had a role in science. Early scientists used them to time experiments, measure pulses, and even calculate speed. Galileo himself supposedly used an hourglass to time his pendulum experiments, which is kind of hilarious, because the man who revolutionized physics was basically working with a glorified kitchen timer. But again, it worked. The hourglass was simple, portable, and consistent enough for rough measurements. And in a world without stopwatches, that was good enough. The decline of the hourglass, of course, nothing lasts forever. By the 17th century, mechanical clocks were improving. Pendulum clocks, invented by Christian Huygens in 1656, were far more accurate. Slowly, the hourglass faded from serious use, but it never disappeared. It lingered in ships, in kitchens, in classrooms. It lingered in art, in symbolism, in memory. Even today, we still use it as a metaphor, as a toy, as a decoration, because the hourglass isn't really about precision, it's about presence. Watching the sand fall is a reminder to slow down, to notice time passing, to accept it, and so the hourglass remains. A simple device. 2 bulbs, a pinch of sand, and a whole lot of meaning. The hourglass, as a medieval mood, peace, let's be honest. The hourglass was never just a tool. It was a vibe. You didn't just plot one on your desk because you needed to know when to stop talking. You put it there because it looked good. 2 glass bulbs, a neat wooden frame, a little stream of sand. It was basically medieval interior design. Imagine a 14th century scholar's study, candles flickering, manuscripts piled high, a skull on the desk, because apparently everyone needed a skull for aesthetic, and right next to it, an hourglass. Not because he was timing his work, but because it made him look deep. The medieval equivalent of buying a plant you're definitely going to kill, just so your Zoom background looks intellectual. The hourglass in art, painters adored the hourglass. You'll see it in portraits, still life's allegories. Sometimes it's clutched by death himself, just in case you miss the point. Other times it's sitting innocently on a table, reminding you that your feast, your wealth, your youth, all of it is slipping away. One of my favorite details is how artists exaggerated the sand. In reality, you can't see much from a distance, but in paintings, the sand is always dramatically pouring, like a tiny waterfall of doom, because subtlety was not the Renaissance's strong suit. And of course, the hourglass shows up in Veneta's paintings, those cheerful little reminders that life is meaningless. Skulls, rotting fruit, extinguished candles, and right there, an hourglass. Because nothing says sweet dreams like staring at a pile of decay and a sand timer. The hourglass and death. Speaking of doom, the hourglass became one of the most enduring symbols of mortality. Alongside the scythe and the skull, it was part of death's starter pack. You'll see it in tomb carvings, funeral art, even on gravestones. The message was simple: your sand is running out. No matter how rich, how powerful, how beautiful you are, the grains keep falling. Unless you're a Habsburg, in which case the grains fall and your jawline collapses. It's a strangely comforting image, though, because unlike the scythe, which is violent, or the skull, which is creepy, the hourglass is quiet, gentle, almost soothing. Time doesn't explode. It trickles. The hourglass in science and navigation. Let's circle back to the practical side. Because while the hourglass was dripping with symbolism, it was also surprisingly useful. On ships, it wasn't just about marking watches. Sailors used hourglasses to measure speed. They'd throw a log overboard, attached to a rope with knots tied at intervals. As the log drifted, they'd let the rope run out for a set amount of time, measured with an hourglass. Then they'd count the knots. That's where we get the term knots for nautical speed. So yes, the hourglass literally shaped maritime language. Scientists, too, leaned on it. Early experiments in physics, medicine, and astronomy all used hourglasses for timing. They weren't precise, but they were consistent enough. Galileo, for example, supposedly used 1-2 pendulum swings, which is kind of hilarious, because the man who gave us modern physics was basically working with a glorified kitchen timer. The hourglass in daily rituals beyond ships and science. The hourglass trickled into daily rituals. Cooks used them to time eggs. Doctors used them to time bleeding. Teachers used them to time lessons. There are even records of lawyers using hourglasses in court, which is perfect because nothing says justice like a sand timer. Imagine a medieval lawyer saying, "Your Honor, I'll make my case in 1 glass of sand." Honestly, that might improve modern trials. And of course, nobles had to make them fancy. A simple wooden frame, too boring. Wealthy patrons commissioned hourglasses with ivory, gold, even jewels. Because if you're going to watch sand fall, it might as well be luxury sand. The hourglass, as a gift hourglasses, were also popular gifts. Kings gave them to allies. Merchants gave them to clients. Lovers even gave them to each other, because nothing says romance like, "Here's a reminder that you're going to die." But in fairness, it was also a reminder to cherish the time you had, to live in the moment, to appreciate the grains as they fell, which is either sweet or depressing, depending on your mood. The hourglass and the modern mindset even after mechanical clocks took over. The hourglass lingered. It became less about utility and more about symbolism. A desk ornament, a teaching tool, a metaphor, and honestly, that's why it's still around today. Nobody needs an hourglass, but people still buy them. They sit on desks, in yoga studios, in board games. They're not about precision. They're about presence. Watching the sand fall is strangely calming. It slows you down, reminds you that time isn't a ticking clock. It's a quiet stream, a slow symbol of humanity's. So, what do we make of the hourglass? It's flawed, inconsistent, easily disrupted. And yet, it endured for centuries. Because it wasn't really about accuracy. It was about meaning. The hourglass is humanity in miniature. Fragile, imperfect, but strangely beautiful. A reminder that time is always slipping away, grain by grain, quietly, inevitably. If you're still awake after 3 hours of sand talk, congratulations. You've either got the patience of a monk or you've already drifted off and this is just playing to your cat. Either way, let's keep going. Tonight, we're moving past the hourglass itself and into the broader world of how people, especially royals and elites, became absolutely obsessed with measuring time. Spoiler, it didn't make them any happier. The medieval clock crazed by the late Middle Ages Mechanical clocks started popping up in European cities. Giant, clunky things, usually stuck on cathedrals. They didn't have minute hands. They barely had our hands. Some just rang bells at vaguely regular intervals. But people were impressed. Imagine being a peasant who's never owned a spoon. And suddenly there's a 30-foot iron contraption in the town square that claims to tell you when to pray. Of course you're going to think it's magic. Kings and nobles, naturally, wanted their own. Because nothing says I'm powerful like owning a machine that makes loud noises on the hour. Charles V and his clock fetish take. Charles V of France, for example, 14th century, known as Charles the Wise, which is generous considering he spent a fortune on clocks. He had one of the first private mechanical clocks installed in his palace. Not because he needed to know the time, he barely left the palace, but because it made him look sophisticated. And of course, he made sure everyone knew about it. Visitors were shown the clock like it was a prized jewel. "Look," he'd say, "it ticks." Meanwhile, his peasants were starving. But hey, at least the king knew when it was 3:17, the royal time. Problem here's the thing. Royals didn't actually need clocks. Their schedules weren't exactly tight. Nobody was saying, "Sorry, Your Majesty, your beheading is at 2:15 sharp." But they loved the symbolism. Owning time itself, controlling it, displaying it. It's the same reason modern billionaires buy yachts the size of small countries. Not because they need them, but because they can. The hourglass hangs on heaven as clocks spread. The hourglass didn't disappear. In fact, it became even more symbolic. Clocks were loud, mechanical, public. Hourglasses were quiet, personal, intimate. You could hold one in your hand, watch the sand fall, pretend you were contemplating mortality when really you were just bored. Sailors still relied on them. Monks still used them. And artists still painted them. The two technologies coexisted, like vinyl records and one was flashy and modern. The other was nostalgic and moody. Time and anxiety, here's where it gets interesting. The more people measured time, the more anxious they became about it. Medieval peasants didn't care if it was 2:37. They cared if the sun was up or down. But once clocks and hourglasses spread, people started slicing their days into smaller and smaller chunks. Work hours became stricter. Prayers became more regimented. Life became more scheduled. And with that came stress. Because once you start measuring time, you start worrying about wasting it. So in a way, the hourglass wasn't just a tool. It was the beginning of modern anxiety. Congratulations, Royals and their weird time habits. Let's float over to some royals again, because they always make things more entertaining. Philip II of Spain was obsessed with punctuality. He scheduled his entire day down to the minute, which sounds impressive until you realize he spent most of it sitting in a gloomy palace micromanaging paperwork. Truly, the life of a king. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, took it further. He scheduled his waking, eating, and even bathroom breaks with clock-like precision. Courtiers had to attend his levee, the royal waking ceremony, at the exact time. Imagine being forced to watch your boss get out of bed every morning, and being punished if you were late. Meanwhile, Frederick the Great of Prussia supposedly timed his flute practice with an hourglass. Because nothing says military genius like making sure your sonata doesn't run over. The hourglass as punishment here's a fun twist. Hourglasses were sometimes used as timers for punishment. In schools, naughty children were made to kneel for one glass of sand. In courts, minor offenders might be forced to stand in shame until the sand ran out, which is both cruel and hilarious. Imagine being sentenced to 2 hourglasses of embarrassment. At least it was better than losing a hand. The hourglass in popular culture by the Renaissance, the hourglass was everywhere. Not just in art, but in literature, theatre, even jokes. Writers used it as shorthand for mortality, patience, or boredom. Shakespeare references hourglasses in his plays. Not because he cared about timekeeping, but because audiences instantly understood the metaphor. Sand falling equals life ending, simple, effective, depressing. The slow decline by the 18th century, the hourglass was fading. Pocket watches with a new status symbol. Clocks were everywhere. The hourglass looked old-fashioned, but it never vanished. It lingered in ships, in classrooms, in kitchens. It lingered in art, in memory, in symbolism. Even today, we still use it. On desks, in board games, as emojis, because the hourglass isn't really about telling time. It's about feeling time, watching it slip away, quietly, inevitably. Time as a weapon of power. One of the strangest things about the spread of clocks and hourglasses is how quickly rulers realized they could use time as a tool of control. Before mechanical time, life was seasonal, flexible, and frankly a bit chaotic. You worked when the sun was up, you stopped when it was dark, and nobody cared if you were 5 minutes late. But once bells started ringing on the hour, suddenly there was a new kind of discipline. Cities rang bells to mark curfews, to summon workers, to regulate markets. Monasteries rang them to drag monks out of bed at ungodly hours. And kings, they loved the symbolism. If you can control time, you can control people. It's no coincidence that some of the earliest big public clocks were installed on cathedrals and town halls. They weren't just telling time. They were telling you who was in charge of it. The tyranny of the Bellimagen, living in a medieval town with a brand new clock tower. At first, it's exciting. The bells ring, everyone gathers, it feels festive. But then you realize the bells never stop. They ring for prayers, for markets, for curfews, for emergencies. Suddenly your entire day is chopped into noisy little segments. And of course, the bells weren't always accurate. Early clocks drifted constantly. So you might be dragged out of bed at 3:45 because the clock thought it was 4 o'clock. But nobody argued. Because who's going to tell the bishop his clock is wrong? Nobles and their clock collections by the Renaissance. Wealthy nobles were collecting clocks the way modern billionaires collect sports cars. They weren't just practical tools, they were status symbols. Some nobles had entire rooms filled with ticking, chiming, clanging devices. Imagine trying to sleep in a palace where 50 clocks are all slightly out of sync. It must have sounded like a mechanical migraine, but for the owners, it was worth it. A clock wasn't just a machine. It was proof that you were modern, sophisticated, and rich enough to afford something that constantly broke down and needed repairs. Elizabeth I and the fashion of time Queen Elizabeth I of England was famously fond of watches. She received several as gifts, including one shaped like an acorn, because nothing says royal dignity like strapping a nut to your wrist. She also had elaborate jeweled timepieces, which she wore more as jewelry than as tools. After all, she wasn't exactly rushing to catch a train, but the symbolism mattered. A queen who wore time on her body was a queen who controlled it. Time and the theatre of kingship this. Obsession with time wasn't just about gadgets. It was about performance. Kings and queens scheduled their days with theatrical precision. The royal waking ceremony, the meals, the audiences, all carefully timed. Louis XIV, the Sun King, turned his daily routine into a spectacle. Courtiers had to attend his waking at a precise hour, his meals at precise hours, his bedtime at a precise hour. It wasn't about efficiency, it was about power. By forcing everyone to live on his schedule, Louis reminded them that he was the center of their universe. It's basically the 17th century version of making your employees attend a 7 a.m. Zoom meeting just to prove you can. The hourglass as a timer for life's awkward moments. Meanwhile, the humble hourglass kept showing up in the strangest places in schools. Children were punished by kneeling for one glass of sand. In kitchens, cooks used them to time eggs, which is probably the only medieval dish that didn't taste like despair. In medicine, doctors used them to time bleedings, which is both horrifying and hilarious. Don't worry, we'll only drain you for one glass. And in courts, judges sometimes used hourglasses to limit speeches, which, honestly, is a tradition we should bring back. The hourglass in literature writers couldn't resist the metaphor. Shakespeare drops hourglasses into his plays as symbols of mortality and patience. Poets used them to wax lyrical about fleeting youth. Philosophers used them to brood about the futility of existence. It became such a cliché that by the 17th century, everyone knew what an hourglass meant. You didn't even need to explain it. Sand falling equals life ending. Simple, effective, depressing. The slow march toward precisioners. The centuries ticked on. Clocks got better. Pendulum clocks in the 17th century were far more accurate. Pocket watches became fashionable in the 18th. By the 19th, railroads demanded precise timetables, and suddenly everyone needed to know the exact minute. The hourglass, by comparison, looked quaint, old-fashioned, a relic, but it never disappeared. It lingered in ships, in classrooms, in board games. It lingered in art, in memory, in symbolism, because the hourglass was never really about accuracy. It was about presence. Watching the sand fall is strangely calming. It slows you down, reminds you that time isn't a ticking clock. It's a quiet stream. The hourglass in the modern imagination, even today, the hourglass survives. Not as a tool, but as a symbol. It's in logos, in art, it's in video games as a power-up. It's in board games as a timer. It's on desks as a decoration. Nobody needs it, but people still want it. Because it's beautiful, because it's soothing, because it reminds us of something clocks can't. That time isn't just numbers. It's a flow, a drift, a trickle. The strange prestige of owning time by the 16th and 17th centuries. Timekeeping had become a kind of social theatre. To own a clock or an elaborate hourglass wasn't just about knowing the hour. It was about showing that you were the kind of person whose life was important enough to measure. Merchants displayed them in their shops. Nobles placed them in their halls. Scholars posed with them in portraits, usually looking pensive, as if they were contemplating the mysteries of eternity, when in reality they were probably just wondering if their sand was clumping again. It was a way of saying, I am not like the peasants who live by the sun and the seasons. I am civilized. I am modern. I have a device that tells me when to stop eating lunch. The courtly schedule royal courts, in particular, became obsessed with regimented time. The more elaborate the court, the more elaborate the schedule. Louis XIV, as we mentioned, turned his entire day into a performance. His waking, his meals, his walks, even his bedtime were public rituals, timed to the minute. Courtiers competed for the honor of handing him his slippers at precisely the right moment. Imagine structuring your entire career around being punctual for someone else's nap. Philip II of Spain was equally rigid. He scheduled his day so tightly that courtiers joked he could be found in the same chair at the same hour every day, like a human clock, which is impressive, but also deeply depressing. Catherine the Great of Russia reportedly had a fondness for elaborate clocks, filling her palaces with them. They chimed constantly, which must have been delightful for visitors and maddening for servants trying to sleep. The irony, of course, is that these rulers weren't actually more productive. They just looked more disciplined. It was all about appearances. The hourglass in education schools loved the hourglass. Teachers used them to time lessons, recitations, and punishments. A child might be told to stand in the corner for 1 glass, or to copy lines until the sand ran out. It was a neat way of making discipline feel objective. The teacher wasn't being cruel, the sand was. Which is, of course, nonsense. But it gave the illusion of fairness. And for the students, it was torture. Watching sand fall slowly while you're being punished is the medieval equivalent of staring at the clock in detention. Time doesn't just pass, it drags. The hourglass in medicine doctors, too, leaned on the hourglass. They used it to time bleedings, purges, and other delightful treatments. "We'll just drain you for 1 glass of sand," they'd say, as if that made it scientific. It's almost comical. The same device used to time eggs in the kitchen was also used to decide how long someone should be bled for balance. Truly, the height of medical precision. But again, it wasn't about accuracy. It was about ritual. The hourglass gave the impression of control. And in a world where disease was rampant and medicine was guesswork, that illusion mattered. The hourglass in law and politics, even in courts of law, the hourglass made appearances. Lawyers were sometimes given a set amount of sand to make their case. Judges used them to time proceedings. It was a way of keeping things orderly, or at least pretending to. Because let's be honest, medieval justice was rarely fair, but at least it was punctual. The hourglass as a household object by the 17th century. Hourglasses were common household items. They came in all sizes, tiny ones for eggs, larger ones for sermons, massive ones for ships. Some were plain, others were ornate, with gilded frames and decorative carvings. Wealthy families displayed them proudly, not because they needed them, but because they looked impressive, and of course, they made excellent conversation pieces. "Ah yes, this is my hourglass. It measures exactly 30 minutes, unless it's humid, in which case it measures 27. Isn't it marvelous?" The hourglass and the philosophy of time philosophers couldn't resist the symbolism. The hourglass became a favorite metaphor for the human condition. The falling sand represented the passage of time. The narrowing neck represented the inevitability of death. The ability to flip it over represented renewal, or the illusion of it. It was simple, visual, and endlessly adaptable, which is why it shows up in so many sermons, poems, and essays. And honestly, it's still effective. Even today, if you watch an hourglass, you can't help but think about time slipping away. It's built into the design. The hourglass in popular imagination by the 18th and 19th centuries The hourglass was fading as a practical tool, but it lived on in imagination. It became a symbol in art, literature, and eventually pop culture. Death still carried it in paintings. Writers still used it as a metaphor. And eventually, it made its way into games, puzzles, and toys. Think about it. Board games still use art, not because they're accurate, but because they're fun. Watching sand fall is more engaging than staring at a digital timer. It feels more human. The hourglass today, and so the hourglass survives. Not as a serious timekeeper, but as a symbol. A decoration. A reminder. It sits on desks, in classrooms, in yoga studios. It appears in logos, in emojis, in video games. It's not about precision. It's about presence. Because in the end, the hourglass isn't really about telling time. It's about feeling it. Watching it slip away, grain by grain. Quietly, inevitably. You've now listened to more about sand and clocks than most medieval monks ever did. Tonight, we're going to float into the next chapter of this sleepy saga, the people who used these devices, and the bizarre ways they managed to make timekeeping even stranger than it already was. Because here's the thing, once you give humans a tool to measure time, they immediately start misusing it. They obsess over it. They compete with it, and in the case of royals, they turn it into a performance art piece that usually ends in dysfunction. The clock as a royal toilet start with the obvious kings and queens loved clocks. Not because they needed them, their schedules were already dictated by courtiers, rituals, and the occasional war, but because clocks were shiny, expensive, and confusing enough to impress visitors. Take Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire. He collected clocks the way some people collect stamps. His palace in Prague was filled with them, astronomical clocks, mechanical marvels, devices that whirred and chimed and occasionally broke down in spectacular fashion. Visitors were suitably awed, though one suspects the servants were less impressed, since they were the ones constantly winding the things. The dysfunction of two. Much time, but here's the irony. The more royals obsessed over clocks, the less they seemed to actually do. Philip II of Spain, as we mentioned earlier, scheduled his life down to the minute, which sounds efficient, until you realize he spent most of it sitting in a gloomy palace micromanaging paperwork. Truly, the man weaponized boredom. Louis XVI of France was famously indecisive, and his obsession with tinkering with locks and clocks didn't help. While his kingdom spiraled toward revolution, he was in his workshop, happily adjusting gears. Not exactly the best use of time. George III of Britain, yes, the one who lost America, was fascinated by mechanical devices, including clocks. He spent hours fiddling with them, which was probably a nice distraction from the fact that his empire was falling apart. It's almost poetic. The rulers who owned the most clocks often had the least sense of timing. The hourglass as a naval lifeline. Meanwhile, outside the palaces, the hourglass was still doing real work. On ships, it remained essential well into the 18th century. Sailors used half-hour glasses to mark watches, and larger ones to measure longer intervals. The system was simple. Every time the sand ran out, the bell was struck. One bell for the first half hour, two for the next, and so on, until 8 bells marked the end of a 4-hour watch. That rhythm structured life at sea. Meals, duties, sleep, all of it was tied to the falling of sand. It's strange to think about. Empires rose and fell. Revolutions erupted. Kings lost their heads, and through it all, Sailors were still flipping hourglasses grain by grain. Across the oceans dot the hourglass in the age of science by the 17th century. Science was booming, and the hourglass tagged along. Early experiments in physics, astronomy, and medicine all used sand timers. They weren't precise, but they were consistent enough for rough measurements. Galileo, as we mentioned, supposedly used 1-2-time pendulum swings. Early doctors used them to measure pulses. Alchemists used them to time their mysterious concoctions, which usually exploded anyway. It's almost funny. The same device used to boil eggs was also used to revolutionize physics. Truly, the hourglass was the multi-tool of its age. The symbolism deepens, but even as science advanced, the symbolism of the hourglass only grew stronger. Painters kept putting it in vanitas still lifes. Poets kept writing about it. Preachers kept waving it around in sermons. It became shorthand for mortality, patience, inevitability. And unlike the mechanical clock, which was loud and complicated, the hourglass was simple, visual, immediate. You didn't need to understand gears or pendulums. You just had to watch the sand fall, the hourglass and the theatre of death by the Baroque era. The hourglass was firmly linked with death. Tombs were carved with them. Funerary art was filled with them. Death himself was often depicted holding one, just in case you missed the point. It's a strangely gentle image though. The scythe is violent. The skull is grotesque. But the hourglass, it's quiet, peaceful, almost soothing. Time doesn't explode, it trickles. The hourglass in the modern age, by the 18th and 19th centuries. The hourglass was fading as a practical tool. Pocket watches were the new status symbol. Pendulum clocks were everywhere. Railroads demanded precision, and sand just couldn't keep up. But the hourglass never vanished. It lingered in ships, in classrooms, in kitchens. It lingered in art, in memory, in symbolism. And eventually, it found new life in games, puzzles, and toys. Because in the end, the hourglass was never really about accuracy. It was about presence. Watching the sand fall is strangely calming. It slows you down, reminds you that time isn't a ticking clock. It's a quiet stream when clocks became conversation pieces by the 18th century. Clocks weren't just tools, they were icebreakers. Imagine walking into a noble's salon and being immediately shown a clock that played music, or one that displayed the phases of the moon, or one that had a tiny mechanical bird that popped out to chirp. Did anyone need these things? Absolutely not. But they were perfect for showing off. Ah, yes, my clock not only tells the time, it also predicts eclipses and makes tea. Meanwhile, the servants were probably muttering, yes, and it breaks every other week. The hourglass, by contrast, was refreshingly honest. It didn't sing, it didn't chime. It didn't pretend to be clever. It just sat there, letting sand fall, which, in its own way, was more dignified. The royal hobby of tinkering some monarchs, however, couldn't resist tinkering. Louis XVI of France famously spent hours in his workshop fiddling with locks and mechanical devices. He wasn't incompetent, he was actually quite skilled, but it didn't exactly help him rule a collapsing kingdom. Imagine your country is on the brink of revolution, and your king is in the basement happily adjusting gears. George III of Britain also loved mechanical gadgets. He collected clocks, studied astronomy, and spent long evenings fiddling with instruments. Admirable hobbies, but again, not the best look when your colonies are declaring independence. Peter the Great of Russia was obsessed with Western technology. He imported clocks, dissected them, and even tried to build his own. Which is impressive, but also very on brand for a man who once forced his nobles to shave their beards on schedule. It's almost a pattern. The more a ruler loved clocks, the less they seemed to understand timing in politics. The hourglass, as a naval constant while kings were tinkering. Sailors were still flipping sand. The hourglass remained the backbone of naval timekeeping well into the 18th century. Every half hour, the glass was turned, the bell was struck, and life at sea ticked on. Meals, watches, duties, all structured by sand. It was monotonous, but it worked, and it gave sailors a strange sense of rhythm. Even in the middle of a storm, even when the ship was pitching wildly, the sand kept falling, quiet, steady, relentless. The hourglass in religion and ritual back on land. The hourglass still had a place in churches and monasteries. Sermons were timed with them. Prayers were measured by them, and funerals were decorated with them. It's hard to overstate how much people loved the symbolism. The hourglass wasn't just a timer. It was a sermon in glass. A reminder that life is short, death is certain, and you should probably stop sinning before the sand runs out, of course. This message was delivered so often that people probably tuned it out. Imagine sitting through yet another sermon where the priest holds up an hourglass and says, "Behold your life." At some point, you'd just think, "Yes, Father, we get it." Sand falls. Can we go now? The hourglass in art and literature artists never let go of the image. Vanitas paintings, allegories of death, portraits of scholars, the hourglass was everywhere. Writers too leaned on it. Shakespeare, Milton, countless poets all used it as shorthand for mortality. It became such a cliché that by the 17th century you didn't even need to explain it. Everyone knew what an hourglass meant. Sand falling equals life ending. Simple, effective, depressing. The hourglass's punishment and disciplined schools and courts continued to use hourglasses as timers for punishment. Children were told to kneel for one glass. Minor offenders were made to stand in shame until the sand ran out. It was a neat trick. The punishment felt objective. The teacher or judge wasn't being cruel, the sand was. Which, of course, is nonsense. But it gave the illusion of fairness. And for the punished, it was agony. Watching sand fall slowly while you're being humiliated is the medieval equivalent of staring at the clock in detention. Time doesn't just pass, it crawls. The hourglass in science and medicine of them, as mechanical clocks improved. The hourglass lingered in science and medicine. Early experiments still used them. Doctors still timed pulses with them. Alchemists still relied on them for their mysterious concoctions. It's almost comical. The same device used to boil eggs was also used to revolutionize physics. Truly, the hourglass was the multi-tool of its age. The hourglass in the modern imagination by the 19th century. The hourglass was fading as a serious tool. But it lived on in imagination. It became a symbol in art, literature, and eventually pop culture. Board games adopted it. Writers used it. Death still carried it in paintings. And eventually, it became an emoji. Proof that medieval symbolism still lingers in our digital lives. The hourglass as comforted, maybe that's why it endures. Because unlike the clock, which is loud and precise, the hourglass is quiet, gentle. Watching sand fall is strangely calming. It slows you down. reminds you that time isn't a ticking machine. It's a trickle, a drift, a flow dot, and in a world obsessed with precision, maybe that's exactly what we need. The hourglass as a stage proponent of the more amusing uses of the hourglass was in theatre. Renaissance plays often used them as props, a visual shorthand for time is running out. Audiences didn't need an explanation. The moment an actor held up an hourglass, everyone knew what it meant. Sometimes it was serious, sometimes comic. A pompous character might be mocked by being timed with a glass, as if to say, yes, yes, get on with it. It's the Elizabethan equivalent of playing someone off with music at the Oscars. The collector's obsession by the 17th and 18th centuries. Wealthy collectors were hoarding timepieces of every kind. Clocks, watches, hourglasses, entire cabinets filled with them. Some collections were practical, others were absurd. There are records of nobles commissioning hourglasses filled not with sand, but with powdered marble, crushed eggshells, even ground gemstones. Because apparently, nothing says I'm rich like watching your diamonds trickle away grain by grain. Of course, these exotic fillers didn't actually improve accuracy. If anything, they made the glass less reliable. But that wasn't the point. The point was to impress visitors. Ah, yes, my hourglass is filled with sapphire dust. It runs for exactly, well, who knows? But isn't it pretty? The hourglass in the age of exploration. Let's drift back to the seas for a moment. During the great voyages of discovery, hourglasses were as essential as sails. Ships carried dozens of them, each carefully calibrated, or at least as calibrated as medieval sand could be. They weren't just used for watches, they were also used for navigation. Sailors measured speed by tossing a log overboard, letting the rope run out for a set time, and then counting the knots. That's where the term knots for nautical speed comes from. And the timing, done with an hourglass. So yes, the age of exploration. The discovery of new continents, the mapping of the globe, was built on sand. Literally, the hourglass in domestic life back on land. The hourglass trickled into everyday life. Housewives used them in kitchens. Teachers used them in classrooms. Doctors used them in surgeries. There are even records of hourglasses being used in childbirth. Midwives would flip a glass to measure contractions or to time how long a mother had been in labor, which is both practical and slightly horrifying. Imagine being in agony and someone says, just hold on until the sand runs out. The hourglass, as a moral lesson, preachers adored the hourglass. It was the perfect sermon prop. Hold it up, let the sand fall, and remind your flock that their lives were slipping away. Some churches even placed giant hourglasses on pulpits, so the congregation could watch the sand fall during the sermon, which, let's be honest, probably made people more focused on the glass than the preaching. Yes, Father, very moving, but is that sand clumping? The hourglass in funerary art by the Baroque era. The hourglass was firmly entrenched in funerary symbolism. Tombs were carved with them. Coffins were decorated with them. Death himself was often shown holding one. It's a strangely gentle image, though. The scythe is violent. The skull is grotesque. But the hourglass, it's quiet, peaceful, almost soothing. Time doesn't explode. It trickles. The hourglass in the industrial age. By the 19th century, the hourglass was obsolete as a serious tool. Railroads demanded precision. Factories ran on strict schedules. Pocket watches and station clocks ruled the day. But the hourglass didn't vanish. It found new life in games, puzzles, and toys. Board games adopted it as a timer. Children played with it. Scientists still used it for rough experiments, and it lingered in symbolism. Writers still used it as a metaphor. Artists still painted it. Death still carried it. The hourglass in the modern world, even today, the hourglass survives. Not as a tool, but as a symbol. It's in logos, in art, it's in yoga studios, on office desks, in video games. Nobody needs it. But people still want it. Because it's beautiful. Because it's soothing. Because it reminds us of something clocks can't. That time isn't just numbers. It's a flow, a drift, a trickle, the gentle irony of sand. Maybe that's why the hourglass endures. Because it's flawed, inconsistent, easily disrupted, and yet it's strangely comforting. The clock is loud. The watch is precise. The calendar is relentless. But the hourglass, it's quiet, gentle. Watching sand fall is like watching waves, or fire, or clouds. It slows you down, reminds you that time isn't a machine. It's a stream, and in a world obsessed with precision, maybe that's exactly what we need.